around us like blazing wildfire, singing your...
All right, welcome everybody. We we have our tech crew over here, Jim and Rich. So grateful for them giving of their time. Hi, welcome, come on in. So we're just trying to see if we can get this live on YouTube, but we are live on Facebook. So to anyone joining us live on Facebook, welcome, we're glad you're here. There are desserts and coffee over here in this room, as many of you guys know. Thank you to Vicky and Jeff for baking, and Lauren, and I think it was Judy Bauer, who dropped off the blondies. So enjoy those. They should all be gone by the end of tonight. And then there's some coffee, which is caffeinated. Sorry if you already drank it and you thought it was decaf. But you will have a very productive evening when you go home. And then we have some tea as well. We're boiling some more water. But welcome. We're so glad that you took the time to come and be with us this evening. I'm just going to introduce Heath, Dr. Carter, and then he's going to take it away for most of the rest of the evening. Later on, we will have a short time of Q&A, and I'm going to kind of come back and moderate that a little bit. But most of the time, we'll just be hearing and learning from Heath. So let me tell you about him as we get started. Many of you know him. He's now come for two adult education series here at APC, and so we're grateful to welcome him back. Heath is the Associate Professor of American Christianity at PTS, Princeton Theological Seminary, where he teaches and writes about the intersection of Christianity and American public life. He earned a BA in English, me too, kindred spirits, and theology from Georgetown University, an MA from University of Chicago Divinity School in 2005, and then a PhD in history from University of Notre Dame in 2012. He's working on a book right now. He is very busy, in high demand amongst different churches this year, and he's speaking and moderating public conversations about the relationship of Christian faith to a variety of pressing public questions, including everything from racial injustice and economic inequality to political polarization. In recent years, these conversations have often focused on the future of American democracy. And so we're so glad for you bringing your expertise. You're originally kind of part of the Baptist denomination, is that right?
Baptist, yeah.
And now a member of Nassau.
Happily Presbyterian these days. Yeah,
Happily Presbyterian. Now a member of Nassau Presbyterian Church out in Princeton. So before we give him a warm welcome, I'll open us with a word of prayer, and then we will kick off our program. God, I give you great thanks for each of the people in this room, for those who are joining us live right now, those watching this later. Thank you for everyone giving of their time. Thank you for Heath giving of his time and his expertise to rally us around this important question about what does it mean to be a Christian in America right now? What place does our faith have in kind of the public sphere as well, God? These are deep and weighty questions, and so I pray that you would just be here by your Holy Spirit, that you would be speaking through Heath as he teaches us and opens up some of our minds, our imaginations, our perspective on all of the kind of issues that play into this, God. Thank you for this time. It's in your name that I pray. Amen. Amen. All right, let's give him a warm APC welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay. It's great to be back with you all. Good evening. Good to see so many friendly faces. I always enjoy coming back here, and it's inspiring to me to come out on a Sunday evening and see a bunch of folks here. I know there's more folks online who will come out to talk about a really important and timely topic. Also grateful for leaders who facilitate these kinds of opportunities to tackle important questions that are the subject of on people's hearts and minds, not just here, but around the country. It's a good time for them to be on people's hearts and minds around the country. As you know, it's the 250th anniversary this year of the Declaration of Independence. And so I think an appropriate time to think about this idea of the nation, which is sometimes thought of itself as a city on a hill, borrowing this phrase from the Gospels. It's obviously also just a time of considerable anxiety around kind of the intersection of faith and public life, and around public life in general. It's been, I think, a period of anxiety and conflict and challenge for our country and for the churches too. So your pastors have asked me to come and sort of tackle this question and this issue of what's sometimes called Christian nationalism. And I'm excited to talk about it tonight. It's kind of on my mind. There's a new book in my field, which I have just written a review of, that is really centrally about Christian nationalism. So it's really top of mind for me. I want to talk a little bit tonight about how I don't know how helpful the phrase itself is. So just FYI, I want to kind of problematize that phrase for us a little bit, but I think it's trying to put its finger on some things that are important and real and important for us to think about together. The term has really kind of come into prominence over the last 10 years. And it really, I think, basically corresponds to the 2016 election. It more or less corresponds to the conversations that in the immediate wake of that election about how 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, which surprised a lot of people in that moment. I don't know how much you were following the news in that moment, but it was the source of a lot of surprise in the media. It was a source of a lot of surprise in some church circles, especially because some prominent evangelicals had really been quite critical of Trump as a candidate at that point. And so in the last 10 years, the study of Christian nationalism in both academic circles, I think journalists have really picked it up. It's been all over the news. I mean, you can't almost help going online or picking up the newspaper. You're going to see this phrase. It's kind of all over the place. There's been a deluge of books about it. And it's connected often to all kinds of developments that many people consider to be really concerning, including January 6th and separatist communities that are forming out west in places like Idaho and Montana and all of these sorts of things. So tonight I want to think with you about, what is this thing we've started calling Christian nationalism in the last 10 years? Where did it come from? What is it? I want to do that, though, in the context of the larger sweep of American history. And part of what I want to say tonight, I guess, is that the quest for Christian America is pretty old. And so I want to situate what's been going on in the last 10 years in the context of that longer story. I also want to start with just telling you a little bit more. Some of you already know me. I've been here a bunch of times, but a little bit more about myself and my own kind of situatedness vis-a-vis this stuff, this material. I grew up, I'm an American religious historian, but before that, growing up, I was Baptist-ish, but really in kind of small fundamentalist churches in Kansas and in California in the 80s and 90s in what I think you would now call, we didn't call them at the time, but you would call it like kind of Christian nationalist worlds. Those are kind of the worlds that I grew up in. They were the worlds in the 80s and 90s of the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition, those sorts of organizations that in some ways are maybe the predecessors of some of what has happened on the right in the last 10 or 15 years. The world that I grew up in was not a super intellectual world. It was a very devout world. I learned growing up to take faith really seriously, though looking back, in some ways I can see how in the worlds that I grew up in, there was a lot of blending of cross and flag and the kind of blending of Christian faith and American nationalism. I don't know if any of this will look familiar to any of you. This was like kind of a big deal in my world growing up. Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, a kind of apocalyptic, talking about the end times. This was actually, I think it was the best-selling book of the 1970s, by the way. It was a really popular book. When I was a teenager, it was the Left Behind series, which some of you may know, which became, before Harry Potter, the best-selling fiction series, I think, of all time. my mom worked at a Christian bookstore, so there was kind of the Christian t-shirts and music and that kind of world that was really booming in the 80s and 90s. And then, my church would definitely have, the church that I went to would have been the type that would have distributed these voter guides that were sort of nonpartisan voter guides, but that evaluated the candidates ostensibly in light of important Christian issues. So I was in Kansas till I was 10, and then we moved to Southern California, where I spent my teen years at Saddleback Church, which is a large church in Southern California, founded by Rick Warren in the early 80s. It was, when I first started going there, it was meeting in a high school, and it was huge by my Kansas standards. It was like 2,500 people, but a small shadow of what it became. By the time I was off to college, it was closer to 30,000 people. So a huge church, and a church that in its own way was quite different from the small kind of traditional churches I'd grown up in Kansas. But it was not totally discontinuous either. And these kinds of voter guides and everything would have been there. This was where my mom worked at the Christian bookstore in Southern California. So in the world that I grew up in, at that point, I think I definitely remember. I remember my dad telling me that to be a Christian was to be a Republican. My dad told me he couldn't imagine how you could do anything else, and so just that sort of orientation was a part of my faith formation. I went to college and began to make my way out into a kind of wider Christian world. God has a sense of humor. My roommate was a lifelong Catholic. I did not like Catholics when I was growing up. I was kind of taught, I remember at Saddleback, they taught us in the middle school group that Catholicism was a quote-unquote world religion. So that was the kind of world that I grew up in. My roommate was a lifelong Catholic, and he was the son of a Democratic congressman. So I really was like set up here. And I mean, those were also kind of polarized times, actually. It was the fall that I went to college was the Clinton impeachment stuff was all over the news. And I remember two late night Domino's pizza eating debates and conversations with him, about all kinds of stuff. I had never met a Christian before who opposed the death penalty. I mean, it was kind of blowing my mind having these conversations with him. And in some ways, I mean, as I went through college and sort of encountered this wider Christian world, I got some perspective on the world that I had grown up in. I became really fascinated, especially by this apocalyptic stuff. I wrote a thesis at Georgetown on the Left Behind series, and how did this apocalyptic fiction become such a hit among the kind of like middle-class Southern California evangelical world? All that led me into studying American evangelicalism and American religious history. And so that's kind of how I got to do what I do these days. I was at the University of Chicago when George W. Bush was reelected in 2004 by folks that called themselves values voters. That was the kind of thing at that point, if you remember, in 2004. Values voters made the difference for Bush. Growing up in the world that I had, it didn't surprise me that he had been reelected, but I remember sitting in a class and people being flabbergasted in this kind of academic context, just having no sense of how he could have been reelected. And so, interestingly, I think that election really changed the discipline of American history. American historians had largely kind of ignored religion until that point. And it was really the re-election of George W. Bush, I think, that kind of alerted American historians to the idea that actually religion matters if you want to, not just if you're interested, you're a person of faith yourself, but if you want to understand American history, it really matters. And so for the last 20 years, American religious historians have been trying to figure out where does the religious right, which has been such a powerful force in the contemporary United States, where does it come from? We were kind of making progress on that question, and then in the 2010s, along came Donald Trump, and really upended some of the stories that had been told to that point, because he didn't quite fit the mold of what the religious right seemed to be primarily concerned about. And so the rise of Trump has sent scholars, again, sort of scrambling to understand how where we are today connects to where we've been. And I think it's partly out of that this term Christian nationalism comes from. That's partly where we get it from, is the attempt to explain this question of what's driving the kind of popularity of Trump and where he emerges out of. So part of what I want to do tonight is think about this term, what it is, what it isn't, look into the past for context. I want to close by thinking about our faith and how it can help us to find our way through this moment in our public life. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for conversation, because I do think this is a good thing to get other voices going and to have some good conversation together. I'm going to move pretty quickly. It's sort of like condensing a semester-long course into a very short session. So bear with me. Don't hesitate to ask questions along the way if you want. But we will have plenty of time for discussion. So what is Christian nationalism? There are sort of, like I said, there's a new set of, a sort of new literature that's emerged trying to explain this. One of the important books is written by these two sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. They wrote a book back in 2020 called Taking America Back for God. And in that book, I mean, they have a lot of different things to say. They've got a lot of survey data. But they sort of say that Christian nationalism is a cultural framework that blurs the distinction between Christian identity and American identity, viewing the two as closely related and seeking to enhance and preserve their union. This is, I mean, it sounds on the face of it like a pretty good definition, potentially, but it gets really tricky. So some of the data, even in that book, let me see if I can get this to go. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this chart anyway, but yeah, it's not working. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, you can't see this at all, but I'll tell you. So they asked these questions. This is not from their book. This is from a Pew study. The founders of America originally intended for the U.S. to be a Christian nation. That's one question. The U.S. is now a Christian nation. The U.S. should be a Christian nation. Part of what's interesting about the survey data, and part of what's really kind of challenging about this terminology of Christian nationalism, is surprising people register high on Christian nationalism when you ask these kinds of questions. For example, notice, I don't know if you can see it, Black Protestants would say 57, so more than half of them say the founders intended the U.S. to be a Christian nation. A much smaller, so this is interesting, only a quarter of them would say the U.S. is now a Christian nation, but 65% of Black Protestants say it should be. So that's kind of interesting. Perry and Whitehead found actually that in their surveys, the group that scored highest on Christian nationalism, according to the questions they were asking, was Black Christians. So what do we make of that? This is part of what I want to try to explain here, because I think this gets pretty complicated. Part of what I want to sort of argue with you tonight is that Christianity and nationalism have long been entangled in the United States, but in often very different kinds of ways. So one way to put this is that lots of different kinds of people have been interested in this project of Christian America. But it's meant really different things to different kinds of folks. And that's part of what I want to explore with you. This book that I've just finished a review of earlier today is by Matt Sutton, who's an American religious historian as well. It's called Chosen Land. It's a long book. You could probably just read my review, which will probably come out later this week. But if you want, the book is great. It's a history of American Christianity from basically Columbus to the present day. And Sutton says this in the introduction. He says, Christian nationalism, quote unquote, Christian nationalism has influenced activists across the political and religious spectrum, black and white, left and right, for centuries. Americans have never really separated church from state, nor have they truly championed the free exercise of religion. Christian activists from Frederick Douglass to Jerry Falwell use the Bible to try to impose their values and beliefs on the nation. Sutton's being a little bit provocative. But he's not wrong that this quest for Christian America has been really appealing to lots of different kinds of people. So part of what I think might be true, if I can get this to go, is it going to go? There we go. Is that there's actually Christian nationalisms. There's a lot of different ways that people kind of put Christianity and the nation together. but they're not all equally good. Not all the ways are equally good, and that's part of what I want to get into with you tonight. The phrase "city on a hill," I mean, there's this question, right, that often comes up in this conversation. Was America founded as a Christian nation? This is one of the key questions that kind of drives a lot of Christian activism in the public square, is our sense of the history of this country. And the idea for some that it was founded as a Christian nation, and often folks will talk about, the folks who came here in the colonial period, often fleeing religious persecution in Europe, and coming with a sense of divine mandate, divine purpose. So the phrase "city on a hill" comes from a speech that Puritan, John Winthrop, gave aboard the ship as they were coming into North America, where it's a fascinating speech. It's a really important speech. It's a document that's kind of taught. Anyone who teaches American religious history would know this speech. And Winthrop is sort of he's kind of giving a charge to the folks on this ship and saying, hey, we've really got to take our Christian faith seriously. And he talks about all of what he thought that meant. And he says, we should be like a city on a hill. Now, Winthrop has no concept that there's going to eventually be a United States of America, right? When he gives this speech, he's on his way to what would become Massachusetts Bay Colony. The United States is not a twinkle in anyone's eye at that point, but the folks who came, obviously their descendants would be there at the time of the Revolution, and this is where the stuff about Christian nation gets complicated. Oh, so this is actually, I forgot to show you this earlier, this is different Christian nationalisms, right? So we can think about all of these kind of figures as, in some sense, and I'll come back to this in a moment, playing on the idea of a more Christian America, but having very different ideas of what that might mean. This is always a surprise, or mostly always a surprise to folks. I think sometimes actually before I give it away, what do you notice here? Anything? I'll repeat it back so people online can hear, but anyone, what's notable? What's noteworthy? What's that? It's on the rise. So this is a chart, rates of religious adherence, 1776 to 2000. We start early here on the left, and we go later as we get further right. Anyone? What do you think? Shaking your head. What do you think?
I don't believe it. It doesn't feel that way. It feels more like spiritualism.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, he's saying he doesn't, not sure if the statistics quite work. Well, I think that's because it seems surprising, probably, and this is sort of counterintuitive. I mean, part of the story of American religious history is, in the colonies, people weren't that religious. There are some hotbeds of Christian piety, especially in Massachusetts Bay, where the Puritans set up shop. The South was overwhelmingly irreligious. The middle colonies, there's pockets. The Quakers, some of the Reformed communities, kind of smaller immigrant churches, are pretty serious about their faith. But one of the things that, this is not a super controversial point in my field, is that overall Christian practice in colonial America is super lethargic. And that in some sense, the big picture story, one of the big picture stories in the history of American Christianity, is really about the kind of pretty consistent increase in Christian piety and Christian participation over the course. There's some ebbs and flows. And this chart ends in 2000. So, if you were to keep going, you would see, although actually it's funny because those numbers, I think, are even, maybe it keeps going up a little bit first. These days, it's actually about 62% of folks that identify with a Christian church today. That's down from a high, actually up in the 70s or 80s. This is a sort of a little known fact. Now, the colonies would have been culturally pretty Christian, but in terms of these are numbers for people who belong to a church, so it's a small number. We can talk about that. Part of what we know, and part of what so thinking about the quest for Christian America in longer perspective, is that it's really after the Revolution. so 250 years ago, Revolution. It's really after the Revolution that you start to see a major uptick in Christian piety. And partly, it's where you get the rise of what we now call evangelicalism. It's a little bit of, this is a complicated thing. Evangelicalism changes over the course of time. But by that I mean a kind of Protestant faith that really emphasized the religion of the heart, and it really emphasized that God spoke to the individual. This is one of the things about the colonial scene that is really interesting, is that most of those folks in the colonies, religious authority really ran through well-educated pastors and the educated ministry. After the Revolution, you get the rise of these Methodist itinerant ministers and Baptist farmer preachers, and this conviction that grows really fast in the early United States that basically anybody can pick up the Bible and find the truth. And that sort of democratic faith catches fire. It catches fire in early cities. It catches fire out in the fields. It catches fire for the very first time in enslaved communities. This is another fact. I mean, in the colonial period, very, very few enslaved persons are Christian. Almost no one. It's really in the early 19th century that you start to see a major uptick in Christianity among the enslaved. So the democratic kind of faith of that period, let's see if I can, there we go, is embodied in someone like Jarena Lee. Jarena Lee was a black woman who joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the very first sort of black-led church in the country. And she felt called to preach. And she went to Richard Allen, who was the black man who founded that denomination, and said, I feel called to preach. I feel God speaking to me directly. This was the revolutionary thing. This is the post-revolutionary moment. The revolutionary thing is God not speaking through the minister to the people, but speaking directly to individuals. Jarena Lee felt that call. Richard Allen says, hey, that's not in our book of order. She says, okay, fine, it's not in the book of order, I'll go home. But then she keeps feeling the call. She really felt God calling her to preach. And so that's the kind of remarkable democratic faith of that moment. It's a moment where very widely, so more and more people are experiencing what they thought of as new birth, in new life in Christ. The country is becoming more Christian than it had ever been. So in terms of, was it founded as a Christian nation? Probably not. But pretty quickly after the Revolution, you get this huge uptick in Christian piety. And it's happening at the same time that American democracy is starting to emerge. In fact, these things happen kind of around the same time. The kind of revivals of the 1800s, the 1810s, the 1820s are happening around the same time that you start to see the extension of the franchise to poor white men who had not had the vote earlier, and the sort of rise of Andrew Jackson and that kind of more democratic form of politics, a move away from elite Republican politics of the years immediately after the Revolution. Part of the conviction of this world, right? There's this kind of equality that comes through God speaking directly to you. There's also a real sense in that world that we can kind of build the kingdom of God. And that's the kind of quest for Christian America in that moment, right? You see kind of a huge uptick in Christianity, the rise of American democracy, and there's a sense of we can really improve the world. And so you get the founding of all kinds of voluntary associations to fight all kinds of social ills, to form, movements for public education, for care of the poor, for, all sorts of organizations like that. And in some sense, this is like the early days of the fight for Christian America, is that world, the kind of world of early evangelicalism in the decades following the American Revolution. Okay, at the same time, not, kind of at the same time as that, and certainly in the decades after, the fight for Christian America came to mean other kinds of things. So this painting, a really famous painting by John Gast from 1872 called American Progress, captures the idea of manifest destiny, which became a powerful idea in 19th century America. And really was partly the idea that white Christians who had the light in some sense, of science and Christianity were destined by God to take the lands to the west. And so, I mean, this painting really captured a kind of mood, and a huge part of the story of the 19th century United States is that for many folks, the quest for Christian America involved the dispossession of lands from native peoples. Terrible, obviously, the story of the Cherokees is especially heartbreaking, and involved deeply Christians who really wanted the Cherokee out. Some of the missionaries hung in with the Cherokee and actually marched with them to the west as a kind of sign of protest. But Christian America in the 19th century, it meant, on the one hand, folks like Jarena Lee coming to believe that God could call them to be a Christian leader. But it led others to champion displacement and killing of native peoples. It led others, including Presbyterians, we should say, to champion slavery for the first time as a positive good. There had been kind of an embarrassment about slavery in the Revolutionary period, and a lot of fighting about whether it could continue in the new nation. But in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, some Christians in the South and in the North come to argue that slavery is a positive good ordained by God, and that is part of the story of the fight for Christian America too. All these things are happening. Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, part of what, the story of American history, the story of the first 100 years after the founding, is the story of a nation that ends up in civil war. And Lincoln, in some sense, not a deeply pious person himself, but feels like so many Americans have felt through the decades and the centuries, that somehow America is caught up God's plan. That's part of the idea. And Lincoln, in his second inaugural, is wrestling with what on earth is God up to. I'll just read a short section from this speech where you see another... one of the most thoughtful sort of commenters on the fight for Christian America in this moment in our history. Lincoln said in that speech, "Both read the same Bible," talking about the North and the South, "and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes." He goes on, "If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Lincoln gives this speech at a moment when the war is not yet over. But he's wrestling in some sense with the fact that for him, as for so many Americans, it feels like God is involved in a special way with the United States. You can see the kind of conflicting fights for Christian America in the wake of the Civil War. In the wake of the Civil War, you have this remarkable moment of black flourishing in the American South. We sometimes skip over this part of our history. Sometimes it's a story about how the Civil War ends and Jim Crow begins immediately, but the story is actually harder than that. Because in the decades after the Civil War, black people build a new world in the former Confederacy. Black independent churches, black Union League clubs and Republican Party chapters all over the South. Black men were in the majority in the state legislature of South Carolina in the 1860s. You have a black senator from Mississippi. You have a black governor in Louisiana. A new, radically new world was emerging. And for many of those black folks who built it, there was a sense of a kind of new day, a new possibility of a more Christian country, finally emerging out of the wreckage of the Civil War. It's striking that the movement against what they built would be called redemption, the redemption of the South. That's how the white folks who destroyed that world understood what they were up to. And everywhere, it was especially in places where there were independent black churches being formed and where there were flourishing black kind of civic life, that's where you got the first KKK and the emergence of kind of extra-legal violence as a weapon against this kind of emerging black-led world in the South. And it was called redemption. And that movement, it's a long story, I'm going to teach a whole course on it. That movement against the kind of world that was being built, which was laced with violence and laced with terror and intimidation, is how you get to Jim Crow. So there's not actually a continuity between the Civil War and then we immediately kind of fall into Jim Crow. It's actually more painful than that. It had to be destroyed. But it was conceived by the white folks who destroyed those black worlds as, quote unquote, the redemption of the South, the fight for Christian America. I think that post-Civil War example really underscores the way in which Christian nationalism is, in some sense, if we mean by that kind of a widespread sense among very different kinds of Christians that they want the country to look more like God would want it to look. That is a very widespread sense. But the vision of those black folks who founded those independent churches in the South of what the country should look like, what it would mean for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, could not have been more different than the vision of the white folks who, through violence and intimidation, destroyed it. So Christian nationalism, not the most helpful term, because you've got people doing really different things who are in some sense all really caught up in the quest for Christian America. But that means such different things to them. In the 1900s, the fight for Christian America continues. I'm writing a book right now about the social gospel, which in many ways, this is a world that easily you could call Christian nationalist. And by that, I just mean this. Those folks wanted to, quote unquote, Christianize the social order. They really wanted Christian values to be reflected in the law of the land. They really wanted Christian values to be reflected in society. And for them, that meant things like the abolition of poverty. And so they weren't content to just talk about these high-minded ideals. They got together, they had meetings, they talked about how do we get our candidates elected? How do we get our folks? And so, when FDR is elected in 1932, folks in that social gospel Christian world who had long wanted to Christianize the social order had their people in the president's cabinet. Harold Ickes went to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1934 and said, the New Deal is Christ's social program being realized in our time. Frances Perkins, the first ever woman cabinet secretary, longest serving Secretary of Labor, I think, to this day, she was a devout Christian who worked on the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act at a convent on the weekends in Maryland. She was profoundly motivated by her faith in her building out of the welfare state, a kind of vision of a more Christian America. Martin Luther King Jr. in his famous March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech is drawing deeply on both Christian ideas and American ideas. And if you'll remember that speech, there's the famous kind of I Have a Dream sequence. But at the end of the speech, he says that there's that folks have come to cash a promissory note that comes down from the founding. And that is the Declaration of Independence promise that all men are created equal. King has this idea that Christian faith calls the nation to account. And in some sense, calls the nation to make good on its own values and on its own ideas. He is deeply caught up in a kind of way, in a vision of Christian America, that, as we know, as it had been 100 years before, was deeply opposed by other Christians who saw the civil rights movement as a threat to Christian America. And there's just no doubt about it. We know that Brown v. Board was deeply opposed by Christian folks who didn't want black children and white children in the same schools because they didn't want black children and white children dating, let alone getting married. There was a powerful Christian backlash against the vision for Christian America that Martin Luther King Jr. propounded in 1963 and all the way until the end of his life in 1968. We can see this even today. There's so many scenes of Christians in public life in recent years. The scene, of course, of folks carrying Christian symbols on January 6th, 2021, and that time at the Capitol building. There are many, many Christian scenes of Christian churches deeply involved in recent weeks and months in Minnesota, amid the ICE operation in Minnesota. These are folks who have very different ideas of what it would mean for the United States to be a more Christian nation, but that idea that somehow or another America should be more Christian, should more deeply reflect Christian values. In some ways, that project, I think, is as American as apple pie, but it looks really different depending on the kind of Christianity that you believe in, the kind of values that you the kind of faith that you practice. So, what to say about Christian nationalism? I said at the beginning that I think there are Christian nationalisms, and I've tried to kind of give you some examples of what I mean by that. I think, not all of these streams of Christian nationalism, of these quests for Christian America, are created equal. Some of them are really quite alarming, and others of them are quite inspiring, and I think this is all part of what we've got to sort through. I think it's possible to distinguish between Christian nationalism that is pluralistic, that's inclusive, that's democratic-oriented, and Christian nationalism that's more exclusive, that's more theocratic, that's more authoritarian. I think, there's lots of folks who, our friends are the Anabaptists. I don't know how much you know about the Anabaptist tradition. But the Mennonites, there's folks who would say, I don't like either of these projects. I think the purpose of Christianity is to be the church and not to get involved in the state. But that's been a kind of minority report, both in the American past and in the American present. I think the reality is that many folks on left and right, both parties, have really wanted to, in some sense, enshrine their religious values in the law. And so the debate, I think, for folks in our place, in congregations all over the country, really can focus on what does our faith have to say about these pressing public questions. The debate, in some sense, is about the values. Christians in this country have long disagreed about some of the most important issues. But I believe that our faith can be a place where we can reason together about them. Not everybody is going to be open to reasoning together, but more people maybe than we think. What can we say about this project of the quest for Christian America? I mean, I think as we approach the 250th, here's a few thoughts that I have, and just sort of by way of closing my comments. This is kind of how I think about it, and then love to open it up and see how you're thinking. It seems to me, I'm not an Anabaptist, that Christian faith can be compatible with appreciation for the nation, a love of one's country, as long as that love is a proper kind of love of country. The United States has an important history, not just here in the United States, but around the world. I mean, the American Revolution, which began 250 years ago, is a world historically important event. And I guess I find myself with those who would say that there's no problem for Christians to embrace some of the values that are expressed in those founding documents: liberty and equality and justice, the dignity of all people. These are things that seem to me compatible with our faith. I think, like many others throughout American history, I think that we should seek for God's will to be done on earth as in heaven. And that means that we bring our faith into public life. It's not enough. The second commandment, God's call to love our neighbors as ourselves, is a call in some sense into politics. Politics, the realm of politics is where we kind of decide how we're going to live with our neighbors. So Christian faith, in some sense, in that sense, calls us into the public square, I think. And the Lord's Prayer calls us to seek for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. I think our faith also calls us to be honest about the many times that this nation has not lived up to its values and to Christian values. And I think this is an increasingly hard thing, I think, right now to do, but I think it's an essential thing for Christians to be able to talk openly and honestly about how past and present the nation isn't living up to God's high standards for how we treat one another. We've got to be able to talk about that. We can disagree about it too, and part of the reality of life in the world, right, is we're not going to all agree. And if you look at the history of American Christianity, Christians have disagreed about basically every important question. People have also changed their minds along the way from time to time, and I think we can also hope that God's not done with me. I hope that, and if God's not done with me, maybe He's not done with you either. I do think so, to the point that not all Christian nationalisms are created equal. I think there are things that should give us pause. When Christian faith, when the gospel of Jesus Christ gets identified with some things. Trouble ahead. I think when we see the Christian gospel getting mixed up with racism or white supremacy, that's something that should give us pause. When we see that Christian faith is being equated with Christian supremacy, by which I mean the idea that only Christians should live in our society, for example, which is a thing that some people think, or that Christian values should be in a way that would produce persecution of others who don't share our faith, enshrined in the law of the land. There's ways to have values enshrined in the law of the land that are in some sense imposing values. People disagree about tax codes. Some Christians think there should be higher taxes on the rich because that's what their faith calls them to, and that is an imposition. But it's not an imposition at the level of jailing people who don't share our faith. It's not an imposition at the level of persecuting folks who don't follow Jesus. So I think when we start to see our faith entwined with Christian supremacy, we should be worried. When we start to see Christian faith entwined with animosity toward those that the Bible calls the stranger, I think we can be worried. That can be a warning to us. What's going on here? How do we think about this is a long tradition in American life too, of worries about those that the Bible calls the stranger. But the Bible has a lot to say about this issue, and so I think it's something that we should get together and talk about. Militant masculinity, when we see our faith entwined with ideas of domination, of others on the basis of their gender. I mean, I think these are things that we can have pause about. I think U.S. exceptionalism is another big one where, I think, again, I'm a person who I deeply appreciate aspects of the United States, and I think some of those values that are have been with us since the founding are really vital. But there's a way in which a kind of love of the nation can become an idolatry of the nation. And where a love of the nation that goes too far toward a kind of profound exceptionalism can mean that we don't value the people that God made that aren't from the United States. And I'm not sure how we get there from our faith. We've got to be wary when love of country becomes an idolatry. I think when Christian faith becomes entwined with profound inequality, we should be worried. And again, all of these things are things that have important biblical bases that we don't have time to get into. I think there's no question that throughout American history, Christian faith has gotten mixed up with this stuff. And I teach classes on this stuff that, we spent a whole semester going through examples of how Christian faith has gotten mixed up in this stuff. And it's still mixed up with this stuff. And we got to be aware of that. And I think to the extent that we can, disentangle our faith from these kinds of temptations, if you will. I think even beyond that, even beyond the disentangling, that there can be good reason why Christians would get organized and really get motivated and get out in the public square and say, when we see white supremacy or something like that happening in our community, we don't stand with that. And it's really vital to stand up and organize. I've been really struck. I've been here before and talked about polarization and the ways in which it's easy to demonize other people. I think you can stand up for what's right and also not be a jerk to the people who aren't there with you yet. So I guess where I want to partly leave you is this idea that there are real things happening in the past and right now that should give us pause and give us, communities like yours, an occasion to reflect on what does it mean to be Christian in Allentown today, right? And be able to kind of parse out what is the part of the thing that we see happening that's really, does it stand up in the light of our faith? Does it stand up in the light of the Bible and our tradition and the best teaching, social teaching that we can get our hands on? And to what extent, sometimes there's stuff that passes as Christian faith that is some other kind of idolatry, calling itself Christian faith. And I think this is a moment for Christian churches to get together in places like this and to talk about that, about what's what. There's a lot of different kinds of claims being made right now about what it means to be a Christian. And you've heard in this whirlwind tour that I've given you that that's not a new thing. You've seen in the whirlwind tour too that at some level, things that have masqueraded as good faith in the past have done great damage. And that's also happening today. So it's really, I think, important to do that good discernment work in community. I think we can do that work. I think we can get organized when we need to and stand up for what's right. And this is something that you've heard me talk about before, but I really believe it, and it's partly why I don't like the phrase Christian nationalist. Christian nationalists, I've given you kind of this nuanced understanding of how to think about this phrase in the larger sweep of American history, but I think the way the term mainly functions right now is as a kind of insult. It sort of functions, it really is mainly intended to describe Christians who support Donald Trump, and I'm not convinced that it really is doing a lot of good in terms of promoting a better understanding between folks about the kinds of questions, the kinds of discernment I'm calling you to. I'm not sure how much good that term is doing. Again, especially because kind of all the way around, lots of folks want the society that we live in to better reflect Christian values. So part of what, if you see my review of this new book, partly going to be saying, you're going to see me say, let's drop that term and focus instead on the issues that are really the particular specific questions before us. Questions about really tough issues like immigration and race. And these are tough questions, and I think there's a way to really focus our discernment on what does the Bible say about this stuff, as opposed to, I'll just say that, often I think Christian nationalist is a term that people left of center use about people right of center. Often in the rooms where right of center people aren't there, and I'm just not sure what the term is really doing in that regard. So we can talk more about that. Part of my sense of what the way forward should also involve is ongoing attempts as Christians to hang in conversation with one another, to do good discernment work about what our faith calls us to. It is not everyone's job, I don't think, to build bridges and to keep conversation across difference moving. I don't think it's everyone's job, to be clear, and some people probably shouldn't do that work. But some of us should. I think in some sense this term, Christian nationalist, has become another kind of flashpoint in culture wars. It's another kind of name that we can call other people, but I'm not certain at what level it's really helping us as Christian people to find our way forward, let alone to make the country better reflect what we would hope. I've told you all before that in some sense, as someone who grew up Christian nationalist, in the way that we use it these days. The thing that really changed my own heart was people like my freshman year roommate, who hung in conversation with me many years, really loved me, even though we disagreed really deeply about things. He's still my friend. I missed his phone call earlier today. But I really think for Christians, one thing we can be known for these days, and we need to receive this as well as give it, is that we're the kind of people who can find ways to hang in conversation and relationship with people who we think are deeply wrong. Because being loved when we're wrong is something we've experienced. That's what God does for us. And I think the country and the church would be better off if we found ways to do it for one another. Part of what happens when you do that, I think, is sometimes people change their minds about stuff. Sometimes they don't. To the extent that people do change their minds, it's usually because someone who loved them showed them a different way. And this work isn't for everyone, but I think it can be for a lot of us. There's probably not a way forward that doesn't go through some of that kind of work of loving our neighbors, all of our neighbors, even when it's hard, even when we don't want to. So, Christian nationalism. It's complex. It's urgent. There's a way in which there are real stakes to what's happening right now, just as there were in the past. I've given so many examples. There's so many more. I'm curious to hear what you think. Thank you very much.
Do we need a stretch break, or are we ready to dive in? Yeah, stretch break? No, dive right in. Okay, great. If you do need a stretch break, you're welcome to take one as we go. Yeah, Courtney's taking a stretch break. But questions. The way I'm going to moderate this is just to invite everyone to ask their first question first. So you may have like 17 questions. Think of your most burning question and ask that one first. And then if no one else has a question, we'll come back to you. But just to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to kind of get in the dialogue and ask their questions. So, anyone? Yeah, John.
I grew up in the same kind of church.
Yeah. Why don't you give me?
And I saw the involvement way back when prayer was banned from the schools. Mm-hmm. It was the starting in that culture to feel like we're oppressed, or we're not being taken seriously. The next big thing that happened was abortion. You haven't mentioned that. Mm-hmm. But that is a moral issue on the other side. Mm-hmm. And I felt like a lot of very devout Christians that I grew up with, I said, personal holiness was more important than outreach and social gospel. How could they vote for a person like Donald Trump, who was the opposite of the model that they held up?
Yeah.
So it was those issues, and then the gay rights issue that they feel, again, is against the Bible.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to add that in terms of those 6 things that you said are certainly there in extreme.
Yeah.
But the other issues identify how could a really devout Christian vote for that man?
Yeah. 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 I mean, I basically agree. I think it's one of the things that's interesting, and part of, again, why I don't love the term Christian nationalist, which I think mainly functions as just like a thing that we lob at people from one, side to another, is there are really different Christian worlds in our country. And I do think it can be helpful, maybe for the country, maybe for the church too, I think, there are people for whom it was the obvious thing was to vote for Donald Trump. And for some of the reasons that you've just said. And I think it's important to understand that sort of argument, even when one disagrees with it. And I think that can move the conversation forward if we take people seriously. I remember I talked to a woman a couple of years ago who I quickly realized, it was kind of an unintended dinner. I was with a friend, and this was the friend's uncle's new wife. And we were in the Central Valley of California. I was doing some work for the seminary, and found myself in conversation with her. And part of what I quickly realized, like, oh, she's a Christian nationalist in the sense that it's most commonly used in the media these days. And she was very curious about my work at the seminary, and we got into a conversation. And I really took her seriously, and we talked for a couple hours. And she was really overcome with resentment because she felt like she was really just trying to live out her faith and was being ridiculed and persecuted. And, I pushed back quite a bit on her over the course of this dinner, and we had a very, I think, interesting conversation. And at the end of it, she said, "You've given me a lot to think about," which I took as, I don't think she changed her mind about anything, but I think it meant something to her that I was willing to talk with her. And I do think that when one can do it, and again, I don't think everybody's called to it, but I can do it. I mean, I readily understood what she was talking about because that was the world I grew up in. So it was like, oh, I know what this is, and I know how to talk to you. And I think, anyway, so yeah, that is a huge world in our society. Yeah.
Thanks, Don. Yeah.
Who exactly was the first American president who was a Christian?
Who wasn't Christian? What do you mean by that? Because, some people...
I would think Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, he was Christian in his own way. He thought of himself as Christian. This is the thing, though, right? Like, Jefferson thought of himself as a kind of Enlightenment Christian. Lincoln didn't go to church, but he was one of the more thoughtful, theological kind of interlocutors we probably ever had in the presidency. I don't know if Buchanan was a member of a church. Buchanan. Adams was very Christian.
Go back to the founding of our country.
What doesn't?
We were a Christian nation.
No, that's what partly what I was that chart that I put up there, right, is like in some sense at the founding we're not a very Christian nation, and most of the founders themselves are Enlightenment Christians, which would have been regarded as very unorthodox. There are a couple exceptions to that. Patrick Henry is a kind of true blue evangelical in a way, but folks like Jefferson, to some extent Adams, these are folks who are Franklin. They're Enlightenment Christians. They kind of, Jefferson literally cut the miracles out of the Bible and mostly rejected the supernatural aspects of Christianity. Yeah. I think the idea that we were somehow, there is an idea that we were most religious in the colonial period and we've gotten less and less religious as time passed. And I think statistically speaking, it's actually the opposite. Now, again, in the last 20 years, there's been an interesting shift where younger generations especially, and I've talked about this with some of you here before, younger generations are increasingly less interested, statistically speaking, in institutional Christianity. They're not seeking out church membership like their grandparents did. Though it's also, even some of the data, stuff has changed so quickly. Since the pandemic, there's also evidence showing that the kind of curve, like the rise of the nuns is kind of plateaued. There's evidence showing younger men are going back to church, which is interesting, in larger than expected numbers. And there's also evidence that of the rates of church attendance in Gen Z are higher than the boomers now. But belonging seems to work differently for these folks, and so I think that the jury is very much out on what's going to happen in terms of that chart that I put up. I don't know. I think we don't know yet what's going to happen with these nuns, but no doubt that the country got a lot more Christian after the revolution than it was before. That I think is beyond the shadow of a doubt, which is interesting. Yeah, kind of counterintuitive maybe.
I just want to say thank you for the nuances of, Christian nationalism here
Yeah.
that you present. Because even the, the deck that we have for the ad for this session, I'm like, after reading it, I'm like, I feel like it was very vague, but I guess that was the purpose because of what you spoke about.
Yeah.
And it actually helped me to reflect on my own faith where, I went from someone who was looking for a nation where, every tongue will confess, where I'm not there anymore. I'm more of the, love your neighbor. I used to look at, when I found out that Mr. Rogers was a Presbyterian minister, I talk about this all the time.
Yeah.
I was like, when I first found that out, I'm like, I don't think he succeeded in his job, God. Like, you know what I mean? But I'm now there. I'm now the Mr. Rogers. Love your neighbor, Mr. I'm like, but I was there before where I said, I don't think he did his job well.
Yeah.
But now I know that salvation is for the Lord, and that's not my job. So now that you've explained, no, that is my hope, is that Christian nationalism would take rise versus what's, rising now, where, I hear that the rise in young men are, the sales of Bibles are going up, and my daughter is a freshman in college, and in the fall, I'm like, yes, go join clubs and all that. She joined a cappella, great, But I also want her to grow in her faith, but I'm kind of hesitant to say, but because I don't know what she'll find when she gets there. What kind of Christianity is she going to find? So, I'm glad she has critical thinking skills and knows all these things to look out for. But I think that's why it's important for us as a church to state what we believe and say no to these and make it apparent that this is not who we are and why that's so important. Because there is a rise and people are looking for community. And it's been a heavy day. We had Dr. Dennis Olson here this morning.
Great.
So
Wonderful.
It's been great.
One of the best ever. These are weighty questions, and there are really different Christianities out there. And I do think, as in the past, so in the present, some of them have more to them in terms of like what a biblical, deeply sort of faithful take on our faith is. And so there's a need to really, in communities like this, dig in and go deep about some of this stuff and do it in a way that you can, for me, and maybe this is my inner evangelical coming out, but I want to do that in a way that expands our circles more than circles the wagons. How do we expand our circles? Sometimes we have to circle the wagons to protect people. But also, in general, I still think the church and the world will be better off if we find ways to expand the circles of people who embrace a joyful, generous gospel like the one that's preached in this church. I think that'd be a good thing. So how do we offer that kind of clarity and speak into this moment in a way that helps us to hopefully have others join us where we're at? Yeah.
I was interested in what you said about individually trying to make the case for our version of Christianity, of our version of Jesus, to defend our faith. And there are a couple occasions where I felt God telling me to enter into discussions with two people who are really hot-headed, really expressive, and I knew when I talked to them I was going to take a beating. And so I prayed about it, and I went in, and I found that there was a way that it kind of worked. If I said to him, okay, in both cases, I said, these were gentlemen, I said, Doug, we're friends. I love you. Do you love me? And that stopped. Oh, I guess I love you. I said, he said something hateful. I said, so you hate Kamala Harris, right? And he said, yeah, she's from the devil. And I said, how do you feel about that as a Christian, I didn't judge him. I just asked him, you know, and I kept coming back to love, love, love. And I have to say that those conversations exhausted me.
Yeah.
And I spent a couple days just replaying them in my mind, thinking, did I do that right, God? Did I say something to him that? And you don't get any satisfaction out of it. I don't know what happened after those two things.
Yeah.
You know? But I appreciated your bringing that up because I do think the Holy Spirit talks to some people to say, get in there now.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you're up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think you have to be in there all the time either. You can kind of come in and out as you are able.
I'd like to piggyback about Mr. Rogers.
Yeah. A Presbyterian saint, if ever there was, yeah.
When college students were allowed to pick their graduation commencement speaker, he was the number one speaker that college students picked. But let's think about it. He would be very woke today. The one episode where he sits down with the postman, I believe it is, and the postman's hot and tired, and they both take their socks off and put it in the water.
Yeah.
There was many who thought it shouldn't be aired.
Yeah. Postman was black. Yeah, that's right.
Right. And I enjoy Shirley Temple old videos and everything.
Yeah.
And when she's dancing with Bojangles, I was just looking at it on my phone the other day, and she wasn't allowed to touch his hand. They do the dance and everything, but let's think about it now. Mr. Rogers would be very, very woke.
Yeah.
And I don't like that.
Interesting. Yeah.
So I'm only allowed one question. So I'll make a comment and then a question, which I think is legal. Right?
Sure.
Okay.
Has not been forbidden. Yeah.
I think one of the ways that Christians get around some of the things that don't really make sense as a Christian to be part of, let's say, MAGA, is that it's not really Christian, it's more Judeo-Christian values. So it's kind of an overarching concept in which you can pluck different things out of that. People refer to Masonism as part of many of the founding fathers' activities, or even money, right? In God we trust. So there's a lot of those components that they can bundle up and say this is Judeo-Christian, which, and I think it's absurd, because if you're reading the Bible, it's very tough to read the Bible and then go through the list that you had enumerated earlier and say these two things should not coexist. So that's my comment. My question is, I'd love to get your views on the recent debate within MAGA, within the right, on support for the modern state of Israel and how that dovetails with the Christian America. Because I know it's always been there, obviously. Israel founded in 1948, support through the 67 and 73 wars, and on and on. However, it seems like in the last 10 years or so, things have changed a little bit. It's almost endemic to Christians to now support the modern state of Israel, and I think that's something that's very hot right now, and I'd just love to hear your commentary on that.
Wow, no small questions. That's a good one. I mean, I think in some ways the modern state of Israel. I mean, what's happening on the right really recently has been quite interesting, because there's been some important people on the right who have kind of been more publicly critical of the state of Israel in a way that would have been really uncommon in even 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, part of what, I told you all that I wrote that thesis on the Left Behind series. I mean, if you grew up in that world, or if you're familiar at all with the kind of dispensational theologies, the kind of a kind of theory of the end that I grew up with as kind of just, this is what it means to be Christian. The state of Israel figures very prominently in that way of thinking about the end times. And so part of what's really quite interesting is over the last 100 years, arguably, there's been stronger support for the founding of the state of Israel, and then for the state of Israel itself in American evangelical circles, even than in American Jewish circles. I mean, obviously there's been support in Jewish circles as well. but the kind of scope of evangelical support for the state of Israel has been really quite something, and really quite influential, I think, in terms of American foreign policy. This is, again, why people have kind of come to this idea that, oh, religion matters if you want to understand U.S. history. Because, yeah, there is a kind of way in which I think evangelical end times theology in particular became quite important in shaping U.S. policy toward Israel, starting in the mid-20th century especially, and into the more recent times. Part of what's interesting about the current right, and that's challenging for those of us who study American political history, is it's a little hard to know exactly where things are going. And I mean, Trump was obviously a disruptive force for the Republican Party that had been around prior to him kind of coming onto the scene, and was widely opposed by the kind of Republican mainstream in that first campaign. So the stuff like what's the future of the right in the modern state of Israel is a really interesting and actually kind of difficult to decipher question, especially looking to a moment beyond this current administration. I think it's hard to know exactly where the right will end up in the years ahead. It's a little less predictable. We're not in a moment of like great continuity with what went before. There are some points of continuity, but also some points of significant disruption. So, yeah, that's a great question and an important issue for American religious historians, for sure. Yeah.
I guess more comment than question,
Yeah.
but personally, I think of these extreme Christian nationalists as Christo-fascists.
Yeah.
Not nationalists. They're
Yeah.
really fascists. And then my other thought, well, I have many, but James Tallarico,
Yeah.
who's running for Senate,
Yeah.
unfortunately against Jasmine Crockett,
Yeah.
but he's also studying to be a Presbyterian minister.
He's a student at Princeton Seminary. Yeah.
But he really speaks the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think he's calling out the right in ways that really make people say, yeah, wait a minute, he's right.
Yeah.
He's right about that.
Yeah.
That's what the gospel says, not what these other people are saying. So it'll be very interesting to see where he goes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he's a great example. I mean, this review of this book that I mentioned earlier, I talk about Tallarico a little bit, and I talk about, I mean, there's a way in which he sits within a really important tradition. I mean, I think this is the other thing when we think about Christian nationalism, we think about kind of Christianity in public life. The last generation has been one where Christianity has powerfully boosted the fortunes of the political right. But not that long ago, maybe in the lifetime of some in this room, actually the Christian left was pretty powerful in the kind of era from the 1930s through the 1960s, kind of the New Deal, Great Society, Civil Rights Movement years. Those were years where Christians on the left really got a lot of important legislation through, that some of which is still with us. I mean, I talk about this in the review. The Social Security Act is a kind of product of an earlier Christian national vision, and it's still with us. And Tallarico sits within that tradition in a way, and I think is an interesting reminder that Christianity hasn't always gone right in politics, which I think sometimes it's easy to forget because we have been living in a generation where Christian activism in the public square has more powerfully aided the right, but it hasn't always been that way. And so he's a fascinating figure. I say, I mean, one of the, I think there's sometimes also some confusion in the critique of Christian nationalism. I think I mentioned this in this review that, Tallarico, in some of his criticisms when he was on Colbert, Colbert tees it up for him, and then he doubles down on this idea that the religious right is a political movement. He says, and Tallarico says that's exactly what it is. And it's kind of ironic to me because he's running for Senate, And so it's like, I don't think your issue is actually that these folks are bringing their faith into the public square. It's with the content of their faith. You know, it's not that it's not that the religious right is a political movement. That's not the problem. Actually, I think Tallarico would probably want to build a political movement behind his version of what Christianity is. I think his real issue is with what those folks on the other side think Christian faith calls us to. And that's, I think, where the interesting conversation in some sense is. That's what I think, like, churches like this one can be really hotbeds of really important discernment and discussion about, like, what does the Christian faith have to say about X? Yeah. 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 I don't know. Lindsay's in charge, so I gotta, yeah.
Others who have a question who haven't gotten to speak up yet? Did I see you on hand, Nancy? Yeah.
We accept comments too. We got lots of comments going. We love it. Yep.
Yeah, no, I think that the Christian nationalism that we think of today, it's all about political power. Mm-hmm. And it's not about Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so I think our job as the church is to really talk about what Christianity is. Yeah. And that what they're demonstrating, what they're calling Christian nationalism, is not Christianity.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the values are, like you've talked a lot about Christian values, and you lifted up before the value of taking care of the poor. Yeah. What are some of the values that they're lifting up that attract Christians?
On the right, you mean? Like what kinds of values are appealing? Yeah, I think this gentleman right here kind of spoke to some of those. I think there's a certain way, you know, if I get into the head of people that I've talked to, there's a way in which I can imagine they would say this. They would say, look, the most important issues for Christians are the dignity of human life, and so for that reason, I can't support any candidate who is pro-choice. And I also, as a Christian, have a very, what they would call traditional understanding of gender and sexuality. And I can't support a candidate who doesn't support a traditional understanding of gender and sexuality. And I think if you've come to believe that those are the defining issues of the Christian faith in public, as I think some folks have, and there's been certainly a lot of Christian formation of different kinds that has gone into kind of, I think, building up that idea that those are the key issues. Then, you know, some folks, I think, can really excitedly rally behind a candidate who's going to champion their views on those questions. Other people will rally with a little maybe more reservations. But I don't think it's you know, and I think it is, and this is what this most recent election underscored, is that the kinds of Christians that are drawn to the right these days, it's not only white evangelicals. I was given a talk at SMU a number of years ago, and I had a cab driver who was from Africa and who talked about his deep love for the president, and he thought that the president had been, you know, really chosen by God to lead the country, and he talked about these issues of abortion and gender. So I think you know, the last election showed that those things pulled on the hearts of a more racially diverse coalition even than in 2016, and so you know, that's a serious thing for other Christians who aren't in those worlds to understand, that I do think, there are people in that land, those circles who really understand what they're up to as deeply Christian. Now, I think, and so how do you move the dial? I think that's an interesting question, and I think partly for me, there's different ways to move the dial, but it can help to understand what's going on in these other worlds. I think when I got to University of Chicago, I mentioned that Bush was reelected. I was a pretty conservative evangelical in 2004, and I remember sitting in this classroom and hearing my professor and all of my fellow students talk about how they just couldn't believe that Bush got reelected, and how can Christians support him? And I actually was like, I know, because I came from that world. I'm not surprised. But that is part of what's happened in our society over the last 20 years, is the kind of pulling apart of worlds. And I mean, I've talked about with you all, this is a few years ago, but there were times in the past where American Christians would get together in a room, a pretty wildly diverse room, and hash it out. And we don't do that anymore. And I don't think most of us want to. I think, I've talked here with you all about the Federal Council of Churches, which was the most important Protestant organization Presbyterians were really involved in its founding in 1908. And when those folks got together, it was like, radical black folks from Harlem. It was Southern segregationists from Georgia. It was white supremacists from Pennsylvania who were happy to join with their brothers in Georgia. There was a huge array of folks, and they would get together in that room. And what's fascinating about that room to me, and this is again part of why my last slide, I'm going to nerd out for just 1 second here. You have to forgive me, but that was a room that was overwhelmingly white. It was overwhelmingly white Protestant world, and in the early days, it was exclusively men. There were some black folks who were in those rooms in 1916, so the third meeting of this organization. This guy, Reverend Ransom, who's a black socialist, is in the room, and all these folks are talking about lynching, and white people are standing up and saying, well, lynching's not great, but unfortunately, we know why it happens. And there had been this terrible lie that white people told, that lynching was always in response to rape. And Reverend Ransom, who's in this room, stands up and calls everybody out. It's kind of an amazing moment, because he's in the room. We don't have those rooms anymore, right? What's really interesting is that in the 1920s, black leaders in the FCC, in the vast minority of that organization, started working, they have a vision for changing Christianity, changing what the church is going to stand for. So in the 1920s, George Haynes, who's a black leader within the FCC, again, very small minority of this overwhelmingly white organization, he says, let's have exchanges of delegations between white and black churches one Sunday a year. It'll be Race Relations Sunday. And I read a paper from a graduate student a couple of years ago about this phenomenon. He's super critical. He's like, oh, this is just kind of make you feel better kind of stuff. It doesn't really move the dial at all. But George Haynes had a vision. 20 years later, in 1946, the Federal Council of Churches became the first predominantly white organization in the country to condemn Jim Crow. Kind of remarkable. It happened because there were black people in the FCC. And it happened because some of the white folks who had been in that organization changed their minds. So I find that to be a hopeful story. But it does involve a lot of uncomfortable conversations, proximity to people that you deeply disagree with, and a willingness to hang in for the long haul. I don't think we do that very well these days. And so in some sense, I'm challenged by the example of Reverend Ransom and George Haynes and these folks. And I think if you're looking at how do you change the church in the world, I'm inspired by their example. I'm like, wow, if you could tell me I'm going to give you a group of a representative group of white Christians in 1908, and 40 years later, they're going to beat both political parties to the punch on condemning Jim Crow, I'd be like, how'd they do that? And it was not easy. It was not easy. And so anyway, I think you got to have those rooms though. And not all of us should be in those rooms, but some of us should be, and we don't find ourselves in those rooms. So there's actually, I've talked about this before here too, that there's structural challenges here where I think social media and big sort, the fact that we move away from each other, the fact that churches increasingly are places where, people gather who already agree about politics. So churches like this one, I think, at least a little bit, are where people don't agree about politics are increasingly rare. So where can you have the kinds of conversations that unfolded in the Federal Council of Churches? I don't know. It's really it's like a structural issue. But it's a serious one for our country. And part of what I think why I am like, let's not use the word Christian nationalists anymore, is because I think in general we've got to move beyond like kind of name calling and move into deep, hard work of discerning what does it mean to be Christian in 2026. And I think in some ways, like lobbing the name Christian nationalists at people doesn't actually advance that project. I worry it doesn't. I worry it just kind of like we end up feeling self-righteous who use the term to describe the others who are, and I just don't know if that's moving the ball down the court.
So,
yeah.
You hit so many, just multiple home runs there. I was going to have comments and questions. But now my question is, how do we become better at reaching out to people without putting their guard up, without necessarily the mission of I'm going to change their minds, but how do I be more curious about the other person? How do I get where they are and move in close and break down the barriers?
Yeah.
And of course I say I, but I mean all of us. And also yay for all of us for being here, because we are a relatively diverse group.
Yeah.
And thanks again for...
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I wrestle with this question a lot when I talk to folks, and I think, I do think, I don't want to encourage you to like go make friends to change minds. I don't think that works. But I think many of us have in our own lives, in our families, in our friend networks, in our communities, people who see the world differently than us. And I always see online people who are like, oh, I've just unfollowed everybody who said this, or and I get that, and again, I think each of us needs to do our own discernment work about what we are capable of and called to, and not everybody's called to this work, but I think more of us may be called to it than we think, and so I don't know where to tell you to begin, but I think it often is like, it can be simple. It can be, asking more open-ended questions when you meet somebody for the first time. It can be playing on a soccer team that doesn't run through, or going to a church, or doing things that are like not running through the hardest issues that we have to talk about, and getting to know people in other contexts. Part of why it's so hard right now is, and I've talked about this, I think, a couple years ago here, is in some ways, like, we used to have lots of different kinds of identities that defined who we are, and increasingly, and I think this is a lot because of billionaires running social media companies, we are politically identified, and politics is our mega identity, and everything else slides underneath it. Politics is really important. You heard me say earlier, like, I think the gospel calls us into political life, into the public square. But I also think there may be a deformation of our political culture such that we won't often our lives are increasingly sealed off. So I don't know, like, I think in the case of any one of us, the answer may be different. But some of us have folks already pretty close to us. I have many people in my family that, for me, it's like, I try to stay in touch with them. And when they post stuff that puzzles me, I sometimes send them a DM, and I'm like, why do you think that? Like, I know we're both Christians, and I honestly can't understand how you can think that. And we've had some good conversations, and I got a note from, I think maybe I've told you, I got a note from a cousin a few years ago who said, growing up, my family told me you were the devil. And he's like, but I've really come to be really grateful. You were one of the only people I realized earlier in my life who was pointing to a different way to be Christian. And so I think that part of it is like, be who you are, stand up for what's right, lean into what you feel God is calling you to. Don't be a jerk to other people. You never know what God might do. And you never know how the seeds that get planted that may seem like there's no fruit in that year or the next year or the next year, 10 years later, you may hear from somebody and God's done a new thing in their life. And maybe they look back on an earlier moment where you played an important role. You know, I think that's part of what I do think is possible. So I want to call us to like lean into those possibilities that God might do things that surprise us. I am.
I know we're running low on.
I think we can ask for the Holy Spirit to help us out. Absolutely. I'm for it. I'm for it.
I know we're running low on time here, but we do have at least 2 more questions.
Okay.
So can we field those and then we'll see where we're at. But I think we could wrap up and then maybe you could stick around if people have a few more questions. So.
Hi, quick comment first. I think a lot of Americans have been shocked by what they've seen in the last 6-8 months. And I've been inspired by what I saw as incredibly Christian works on the streets of Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And I also, I'm a practicing Catholic, and I've noticed that the American bishops, a notoriously, well, I shouldn't use that word, but very conservative movement, is now speaking out aggressively against the policies of the administration. But my question is, isn't there a large group on the right that embraces their identity as Christian nationalists and also see Trump as like a figure out of the Bible, sort of like a Cyrus-type figure? And as a precursor, recognizing that he's flawed, but as kind of a precursor to a more Christian prince, as they might call it. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. Do you want me to give? Are we doing one at a time, or okay? Yeah, there's definitely a world of people that think that, and who, I mean, I think in some congregations, I mean, there'll be statues of Donald Trump built for people who see him as a kind of divinely ordained figure. Certainly the assassination attempt a couple years ago in the summer before the election, I mean, that confirmed for some folks that kind of sensibility. So there's no doubt about it. And I think, you know, again, I have folks in my life who think that, and I think there's a way in which some of them will never change their minds. So I mean, I'm not so naive to think that like, you know, everything's going to be easy or right in a short time. But I think I think we can find ways to hang in even with some of that crowd. That was the crowd I grew up in, you know, and so I think that's where partly maybe my optimism comes from. I do think the other thing that I'll say that was interesting, the Catholic bishops speaking out. I mean, one of the things that's really hard these days too is to find ways to build coalition with people that we don't agree with everything about. That's increasingly difficult, but I think it's also really important. You know, just because you don't agree with everything a person thinks, when you agree about something, there's something to build on there. And the Catholic bishops is a fascinating case of that, right? Where there's going to be a lot of people on left of center who are going to disagree with the Catholic bishops on lots of stuff. But can we partner together? I think about that with churches too. I mean, there may be more conservative churches in this area that this church would find major differences with, but maybe they're also concerned about hungry people in Allentown. Maybe that's a way to get in touch with people who disagree is you don't have to agree about everything to partner on something that's important. I think that's an important thing that we don't do enough of these days. Yeah. You say there's one more? Yeah. Yep.
How you doing?
I'm great.
So you talked about the rise in Christianity, Bible sales among our youth, especially men. I attribute that a huge deal to the rise of Charlie Kirk, who was known for being very close with our president and the MAGA movement, but also deeply religious, deeply Christian. Now, I know this is a hot button issue as well, and I don't expect you to speak ill of the dead, but do you have any comments on what parts of his movement were net positives, net negatives? he had a huge impact on my faith and my getting into politics, and his death had a huge impact also. So if you could speak to that.
No small questions at the end either. Yeah, lots to say. So I actually, this was one of the things. So my cousin, after Kirk was killed, posted about him in a very similar vein, like how important he had been to his own faith. And I had followed Kirk just very casually, kind of occasionally he would pop up for me. But I messaged my cousin and said, can you help me to understand how this person is so important to you and how you see them in this Christian life? Because I thought of him mostly as a political activist. So he sent me a bunch of stuff. And I actually, partly because this is my job, I went and listened to a couple episodes of Kirk's podcast after, and they were both episodes that were taped at churches, one in Arizona, one in New Mexico. And so I'll say a few things. I mean, one is he and I disagree about a number of important things. I'll just say that. I think that's fair to say. I think he wouldn't mind me saying that I think he and I disagree about a number of important things. What was really striking to me in listening to those podcast episodes was, I mean, these were like packed houses of people in these places that are coming out to talk to him. And I knew him mainly as what I thought of as a kind of Republican activist. There had been a Turning Points USA chapter at the university that I taught at in Indiana, and I knew friends who had been put on the professor watch list by that organization and who had received threats of violence to them and to their families at their homes that had to, so that was the main way I knew about him, and those things gave me great concern. But I listened to the podcast, and one of the things that was so interesting to me, and it made me think a lot about the work that we are not doing at Princeton Seminary right now, but maybe should be, is people got up at these churches, and after, there'd be a conversation between him and a moderator, and then there'd be a Q&A. And they would get up, and I remember the questions. They'd be like, Mr. Kirk, I'm a baby Christian, and I want to know, did the coming of Jesus, in God's covenant with the Jews, or how does that work? They were like, Mr. Kirk, I want to know, what's the authority of the book of Enoch? Or what do you know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? So I was listening to these podcasts, and I was like, wow, this guy was a kind of theological authority for a whole world of people that Princeton Seminary doesn't talk to. And I mainly thought to myself, gosh, we really should do a better job of getting out beyond our worlds, because there's worlds of people who are really hungry for theological understanding. And he played that role for a lot of people. I think he's wrong. He was wrong about a lot of stuff. And so for my part, I was left feeling gosh darn it, Princeton Seminary needs to get more out there and talk to people who are hungry to know more about God. So I admire that about him, that he did offer and connect with people that, frankly, my colleagues and I haven't shown an ability or an interest in connecting with. And I think that's an indictment of us. I think he was really wrong about some important things. And so in that way, too, I lament that, in some sense, voices that I think are more right about some important things are less out there. But I think for him to offer himself, and I thought some of what he said, I also, one of the podcasts, he really came after anti-Semitism. I thought that was great. He said, if you're a guy at home on the internet blaming the Jews for the fact that you don't have a job, you need to wake up. And so, I didn't find everything that he said to be wrong. Some things I thought were really actually on point. But I thought he was importantly wrong about some things. But I did find, I guess what I'll say in closing is this, and maybe it connects to some other things that I've said, that I got after he was killed, I got the version of social media that my extended family, who are in what we would most commonly call Christian nationalist worlds, that they were putting out there. And then I had my lefty academic friends and everything giving a very different version. And the podcast rewarded my listening, because it didn't quite fit into either of those. It was a little more complicated. And I learned a lot more about why he was as important to folks like yourself and my cousin. And I think it was worthwhile in that sense to take that time. And maybe that's another way, that not all of us need to do that, but I think for many of us to find the time to take people seriously who we think are even really deeply wrong might move the ball forward. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is a good word to end on. I was just thinking about that word hunger, that I really do think that there's a hunger in our country, and that's part of what's spurring some of this on, right? There's a hunger for our lives and our existence in this particular place to mean something maybe more than what it just is at face value right here and now. And I think that's important for our congregation and our communities. We've been seeing that hunger in our congregation too. People are hungry to get into the Bible and understand, some of those questions that you heard on the podcast are questions that I hear from our congregation. And we are still figuring out how to do some of that education, how to kind of offer those spaces for people. So I love that word hunger, and how are we responding to that? Like what food is on offer, right? Because people are going to go to find that hunger, that need met wherever they can.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, please.
I just want to thank you all for coming out. And I really think this is an important conversation, and it's not often. I mean, I really have a lot of admiration for your congregation. I've been here 3 times, three different kind of seasons of your church's life, and I have a lot of admiration for folks who will take their faith so seriously to come out and be here at 8:40 on a Sunday evening, and to be able to sit in a room that doesn't maybe entirely agree about everything. I think that's really hard, and I admire you all. Thank you for your witness, and I think may it grow. May it grow.
Amen. Thanks, Heath. So yeah, in the interest of time, I'll say maybe you can stick around for a few minutes, but not tons of minutes. But if you have more burning questions or comments, or you want to have a little one-on-one interaction, feel free to do that. There's some more treats over there, and otherwise, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming out.